Have you ever wondered how a word can change your life? Maybe stop you in your tracks. Maybe make you imagine that life can be different. Words have that power. We're going to be talking with poet Malcolm Guite about the relationship between words and imagination. Stay tuned for Good God. Welcome to Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. I'm your host, George Mason, and I'm delighted to welcome to the program today the poet and priest, Malcolm Guite, all the way from England. Malcolm, welcome.
I'm very pleased to be here.
Wonderful. Well, Malcolm is most known to me as a poet now, and we've had a wonderful visit in the last few days as he's been visiting here with the people at Image, who are an organization that produces a journal called the Image Journal, and is consistently eager to make the connection between faith and the arts.
Absolutely. I think the tag is art, faith, and mystery. It's just, very deep engagement with both the faith community and the community that produces the arts in contemporary society.
But when you use the word mystery, we are drawn into both the world of the arts and the world of faith.
Indeed.
And yet not everyone makes the connection between the two, right? In fact, early on, you didn't either, but you were drawn by the arts into faith. Can you say a little bit about that?
That's right. Well, I mean, as it happens, I was brought up in a Christian household, but maybe like many teenagers, I thought I'd grown up out of that. I swallowed the lie that somehow material science had disproved it and that it solved and explained every mystery. And this was in the days when you used to read sort of B.F. Skinner's behaviorism and all of that.
Yes.
And but then I had an experience of real epiphany through the arts, through poetry, actually through reading the poetry of Keats. And I just realized that I couldn't reduce everything to a formula.
Right.
That there's one thing to know the facts, but it's another thing to know what they mean.
Yes.
And I found in the experience of great poetry, but of other arts too, that there was what I've subsequently learned to use a theological word, pleroma, or fullness, or overflowing.
Yes.
There was something flowing through these. Mm-hmm. I understood art and poetry as gift. I understood the language of the muse, but I really needed to find who the giver was, to try and go upstream through the arts to their source. And I realized great science also tries to go upstream through all the formula to a source, that there is a common source.
There's imaginative leaps that are made
absolutely.
in science. Right?
Yeah, there's some very good work. There's a great British philosopher called Mary Midgley who's written a book called Science and Poetry, which is just precisely about those imaginative leaps. When I came to faith, I actually came to realize that the whole beautiful sort of story of a God who is love, who is an exchange of love in persons, who creates, and within his creation then bodies forth the meaning of who he is in a person, in Jesus Christ. Yeah. I saw that as providing an underpinning really for all the work we did. I mean, I also have been involved in quite a lot of artistic collaboration and working between, say, poetry and painting or poetry and music.
Right.
And I come to see that we're made, I believe very firmly that we're made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. And the image of the God in whose image we're made is both creative and collaborative.
Okay.
Because the Father, gives glory to the Son, and the Son gives glory to the Father and the Spirit. Yeah. So I came eventually to write a cycle of sonnets going through the whole liturgical year.
Right.
And when I came to the sonnet for Trinity Sunday, our liturgical setting for the Trinity was not some abstract thing. Right. It was in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and it was all about God making us and forming us.
Yes.
And I began to realize that his creativity is a source for and an invitation to ours. So I don't know if this helps, but this is this poem, Trinity Sunday.
Good.
And I know some artists have found this resonant. So Trinity Sunday. In the beginning, not in time or space, but in the quick before both space and time, in life, in love, in coherent grace, in 3 in 1, in 1 in 3, in rhyme, in music, in the whole creation story, in his own image, his imagination. The triune poet makes us for his glory and makes us each the other's inspiration. He calls us out of darkness, chaos, chance, to improvise a music of our own, to sing the chord that calls us to the dance, 3 notes resounding from a single tone, to sing the end in whom we all begin, our God, beyond, beside us, and within. And I think that allusion, in a sense, in beyond, beside, and within, to God the Father and God the Son and God the Spirit. When you come to that mystery, prose isn't good enough, reason alone isn't good enough, no demonstration is good enough. To approach that mystery, like Jesus says, you've got to love the God with all your heart and all your soul. And one of the things you need to bring to the table is art and imagination, because they can help us to say many things at the same time.
Right.
And a beautiful shape, whether it's in words or paint or sculpture or in the shape of the liturgy, a beautiful shape holds the mystery far better than a kind of lot of.
So this is an interesting notion about holding the mystery. So there are those who want to explain mysteries as if they're solving a riddle. They're settling what the puzzle is. And in doing so, there's a way of sort of draining all the mystery out of life.
Right? Oh, absolutely. There's a great Scottish poet, Edwin Muir, mystical poet, wrote a poem about the incarnate one, and which is a great affirmation of Jesus as incarnate, the poem. But it starts with, I'm sorry to say, it starts with his experience of bad church as a kid.
Yes.
And you know what he says? He says, the word made flesh is here, made words again. He says, the word made word in flourish and arrogant crook. And then he says this, here, talking about bad explanations, he says, here, the mystery is impaled and bent into an ideological argument. But he goes on to say there's better gospel in man's natural tongue,
Right.
And so what he's looking for, he says there's a certain kind of bad theology which, when God comes to us fully and richly as a person and in and through the lives of other people, it's almost like we're scared, like God's got too close.
Yes.
So we abstract him again. We turn him into a bunch of propositions and put him back up into some intellectual realm.
Right.
And he's always getting past that and coming back to us.
Nice.
And one of the ways I think in our age that he does that is through the arts. Because I think our age has so emphasized analysis and reason and breaking things down into their constituent parts that people are in some sense rebelling against that. They need something with soul.
Yes.
But a lot of people, instead of seeing the heart and soul of that as in the gift of the revelation of the gospel, are finding it through the arts instead.
Right.
Now, instead of throwing up our hands in horror and saying, oh no, but you should be in church, we should be saying, how are the arts mediating to you even a little bit of the mystery? Maybe we can see all the arts as a bit like the hem of Christ's garment, The woman touched the hem and something happened, some power hit, she was healed. Now, she just wanted to sneak right off into the crowd, didn't she?
Yes.
But Jesus stopped, he said, somebody touched me. And they said, oh, and he called her. This woman who thought she'd just get a quick fix and disappear, because she was worried about her issue of blood and she didn't think. He calls her around, and do you remember he calls her daughter of Jerusalem?
Yeah.
She totally belongs.
Yes.
So I sometimes see all of our engagement with the art as like spreading wide the beautiful hem of Christ's garment.
Lovely.
And letting his power flow through it. But we then say, well, if that happens, if I'm engaged with other poets or musicians and they say, where's this coming from? They really ask me that question. I'm not going to impose it on them. But if they say, I say, well, do you know, my faith tells me that creativity has a source in a creator. And we can take the conversation from there.
Well, so it has a source that is beyond us, that is given to us, in a sense. And so it's sort of drawing upon that which is coming to us more than our making it. This
Yeah,
reminds
yeah,
me of Auden's
absolutely.
line, poetry makes nothing happen.
Yeah.
Which, of course, one might take, should take ironically, because Auden's a poet.
Yeah.
If you break it down, it makes no thing happen per se, in that there's something mysterious beyond this thingness of the world.
Absolutely.
But it makes nothing happen.
Exactly.
That is, the word creates.
Exactly,
So
and often what the poetry does is precisely to create in the pitch slow. I mean, you could think of poetry as language slowed down a little, so that you get to savor it. And at the end of a poem, there is necessarily silence.
Yes.
But it's a different kind of silence than the silence at the beginning of the poem. That's the same with music as well, that it enriches something, and then something happens in that. Now, that something that happens at the end of the poem is not entirely in the gift of the poet.
Yes.
It's something that the reader also brings. You know, there's a wonderful poem by Seamus Heaney called The Rainstick Way. He talks about how when you upend the rainstick, you hear this downpour, sluice, thrush, but the beautiful sounds of music, of the music of water.
Yes.
And yet he knows it's only grit and dry seeds. And implicitly in this poem, he says, I'm kind of upending the rainstick of the poem into you. I mean, you are the rainstick. The words flow through you, and each reader's imagination, their own creativity, brings out the music.
Right.
And there's a movement between the two. So I think the poet often experiences the poem as a kind of gift and receives it and does their best to be faithful to what they're being given.
Well, and then the
reader receives it.
So you mentioned Seamus Heaney, and so his wonderful poem, Digging.
Oh, it's glorious, yeah.
Which is glorious when he talks about watching his father and his grandfather before them dig with a spade in the ground, and how they were farmers and the like, and that, you know, he would never be that, but
he says, I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. Yeah.
Exactly.
And when you go back through the poem, you realize that all those things he said about different kinds of digging, about the nicking and slicing and going down and the cool feel, and the cutting through roots and going down for the good stuff.
Right.
You suddenly realize all of that is also about writing.
Exactly.
It's not just I'll dig, it's every kind of digging, you know.
But then when you read something like that, you're not supposed to only, I think, hear Seamus's experience with his father and his coming to vocation. You're also supposed to say, how did I come to mine? Right?
Oh, absolutely.
So I'm reading this and realizing my father and grandfather before me were ship pilots in New York Harbor.
Yeah.
Right? And they thought that this was what I should do as well. And in every possible way, you know, I should have been a captain on the sea. And so it forced me to ask, what's the pen in my hand?
Very good, yeah.
And so then I think about my work now, and I think I'm piloting a people of God. That this is a journey that we're taking at sea, and we have a direction to take, and so this is my work, and it's not that different.
And that's a beautiful long image of the church herself as a ship and stepping on board a ship. I always love the way right at the beginning of the gospel, you know, Jesus gets into somebody's boat, you know, and they push out a little way so he can preach. And then, you know, there's a great moment when he says to Peter, launch out into the deep.
Yes,
And that's that real. No, I think that's actually true. There's a great sermon by John Donne. John Donne was a wonderful poet in the late 16th, early 17th century, who was then called by God to be a preacher and brought the poetry into the preaching. But he's got a sermon in which he says, he has this lovely phrase, he says, when God calls somebody to be a secretary of the Holy Ghost, he never overwrites who they are and what they've been before. So he gives two examples. He says when he called David from the sheepfolds and from looking after the sheep to be king of Israel, he called him from one kind of shepherding to another.
There you go.
And when David took up the pen, as it were, under the guidance of the Spirit, he filled his psalms with images of shepherding. And he said, I am the good shepherd. That thing had a promise. And then he, rather more daringly, John Donne, because everybody knew, everybody listening to him in St. Paul's Cathedral, knew that John Donne was a famous love poet. And
right.
Loads of love poems to lots of people.
The Flea.
So, exactly. So John casually, by this time fully ordained, he says, think about Solomon, he says, Solomon was famous for his many love affairs and his many wives and concubines, but God called him to write a piece of scripture. God called him to write the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. And he didn't censor him. He said, bring me all that passion, and now let's turn it to the story of how God is our lover, how he comes into our souls. And so
Beautiful.
Solomon takes his first vocation and it becomes fulfilled in his final vocation.
Let's put a comma there for a moment, and we're going to come back, and I want to pick up from that into more about your sense of vocation and your sense of pricking in the imagination by what you do.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you for continuing to tune in to Good God. This program is made possible by the contributions of friends of the program, and we are delighted that they continue to support it so generously so that we don't have to ask for additional support every episode. I'm sure you're glad about that too. If you'd like to know where else you can tune in to find Good God, whether in a video format or audio, or even to get a transcript of the program, go to www.goodgodproject.com. That's our website, and it's the best place to go to receive an archive of all the previous episodes and to get a new one each week if you'd like. Thanks again for your support. We're back with Malcolm Guite. And Malcolm, we were just talking about your sense of vocation as a poet and what you hope poetry does through you as a gift to the world. And I think many people are not in the habit of reading poetry. We have all sorts of other media and the like, and poetry seems to demand a little more of us, right?
Yeah, though of course it gives more too. Actually, do you know, I had a very interesting, we were talking about Seamus Heaney earlier.
Yes.
I had a very interesting conversation with Seamus Heaney on this very subject when I interviewed him when he won the Wilfred Owen Prize. And he was talking about how poems people didn't necessarily remember a whole poem. So he's saying, like, how does poetry work? And he said a poem is not a poem when it's just in print. It's not even a poem when it's a bunch of thoughts in the reader. It only gets to begin to be a poem when it's breathed into being and read out loud. But he said, I know that poems will not be memorized in the way they were in the past. But he hopes that, he said, when the poem is really most a poem, is not when you're reading the poem or thinking you're doing poetry. It's when you're out there in the middle of life. Something is happening. You can't quite deal with it. Things aren't in focus. And suddenly a phrase from a poem, like you quoted, the poetry makes, comes into your mind and offers you a clarification.
Yes.
And it gives you, and then this is Heaney's own phrase. He said he hoped that his poetry would offer people, and this is how he put it, phrases that feed the soul.
Nice. Phrases
that feed the soul.
Wow.
So that was, and I feel the same way, I mean, about my own poetry, that I'm trying to listen for a certain kind of music. I'm trying to restore a sense of beauty in the way language is used. But I'm trying to phrase things in a way that will be memorable and helpful. And lucid in the sense that they will elucidate things for people.
And for that to happen, there has to be a way for us to be interrupted in our normal
Absolutely,
lives.
yeah, that's right.
And to be open to those interruptions. You have a poem, I think.
Yeah, so I have, so this is, I mean, it's kind of partly a kind of a light-hearted thing, but sometimes you start with a jest and it, you know. So one time I was supposed to be giving a talk on poetry, which is illustrated with a handout with some of my poems, and I didn't have the handouts done, so I thought, you know, there'll be a photocopying room, which there was just by the lecture hall, and I thought it'd be a real simple photocopier, just put it in and press the button. But it turned out to be one of these really complicated ones with lots of trays, and I couldn't, but there's nobody there to help me, so I pressed a button and did my best, and the whole thing, after a little while, jammed up. And I had to just take what poetry I could, and all these flashing lights, you know, open door, B, jam, you know, the bell was going, so I went off. So after the lecture, I was sneaking back, you know, past the door, and as I feared, you know, this woman came out, tall, striking woman, with one of my poems crumpled up in her hand. She pointed a finger at me and she said, your poetry is jamming my machine.
Oh.
And I thought, that's a great line.
Let's
you know,
use
that's
it.
a good line. Let's use that. So afterwards, we'd sorted it out, and she actually started reading my poem. So I wrote this poem for her. It's snappily titled, "On Being Told My Poetry is Found in a Broken Photocopy." But I realised it was opening up a lot of other stuff as well. So it goes like this. It's a villanelle, so you get these repeated lines, a bit like a photocopy. So here we go. My poetry is jamming your machine. It broke the photocopier, I'm to blame, with pictures copied from a world unseen. My poem is in the works. I'm on the scene, we free my verse, and I confess my shame. My poetry is jamming your machine. Though you berate me with what might have been, you stop to read the poem just the same. And pictures copied from a world unseen subvert the icons on your mental screen and open windows with a whispered name. My poetry is jamming your machine, for chosen words can change the things they mean and set the once familiar world aflame with pictures copied from a world unseen. The mental props give way on which you lean. The world you see will never be the same. My poetry is jamming your machine with pictures copied from a world unseen.
Oh,
So
my
it was
goodness.
a bit of fun, really.
How
but,
fun.
yeah.
Yes, but also beautiful in the sense that what you're saying is there is a kind of angularity of how God intervenes in our
God,
lives.
yeah, God does. I
Right.
mean, a lot of the parables of Jesus are disruptive of what people think is the normal case.
Right, right.
But it's not random disruption.
Right.
I want to say that, you know, there's a way in some forms of modern art that assumes that as long as you're offensive and disruptive, it's art. Now, I don't think that's the case.
Right.
I think there is a time when you need to write something which people might find quite shocking, but that's only because you've got something to say. So I jam the machine, fine.
Mm-hmm.
But photocopy, of course, the photos part of photocopy, it goes back to the
Light.
Greek phos, light.
Yes.
And I wanted to suggest that poetry brings a light
Right.
to us that wouldn't have shone otherwise.
Very good.
And when I say, set the once familiar world aflame with pictures copied from a world unseen, I was thinking of that moment in Exodus when Moses sees the burning bush. You know, he's walked past that bush every day with his father-in-law's
Right.
sheep, didn't think there was anything there. Suddenly, he turns aside. And although the bush is still as bushy as ever it was, something new is there. There's a new light shining from it. And he takes off his shoes from off his feet.
Oh, this is
then-
Elizabeth Barrett Browning, right?
Yeah,
There-
exactly.
yes.
Every
Yes.
common bush, you know, earth's crammed with heaven, she says.
Yes.
And every common bush ablaze, they're seen around. Yeah, we're
Exactly.
singing off the same hymn sheet.
Yes,
Yeah.
we are.
She's
exactly.
great. She's great.
She certainly is.
So then you realise the poem might at least take you turn aside. It might make you look.
Yes.
Now, I would not give poetry the office, which I believe is only God speaking through the Spirit in Scripture, that having made us turn aside, having opened us up, then the Lord, the Spirit, has to speak. Mm-hmm. And he often does it through the Scriptures. And the voice has to say, take off thy shoes from off thy feet.
Yes, yes.
And then wear, you know.
Yes.
But if poetry, like I said in the earlier session, is the hem of the garment, or if it can be the light from the familiar bush suddenly transfiguring the vision, that's a very good starting place.
Yes.
That's what got Moses' attention.
Yes, yes. Well, and this is the incarnation we talk about.
Yeah.
So C.S. Lewis has this way of talking about how as human beings we come to know one another, the mysterious nature of our personalities, only through the body, right? So there has, on this side of the grave,
Yeah.
we are bodily creatures in search of that spirit that is the unique mystery of the person. And it takes work, whether through a word that comes to the light, to the meaning of it. And so it doesn't happen apart from it. We're not this sort of disembodied.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're not trying to
Yeah.
leave the body.
No,
right?
no, not
right.
at all.
And then he has this beautiful image of the resurrection life in which actually what's happening is even now the saints are, they know one another spiritually and they're moving back toward bodily existence in the other way, which I think is delightful to think about.
That's, I mean, Lewis, I mean, is endlessly fruitful and helpful here. Actually, you know, talking about the poetry that just suddenly makes you aware of it opens a window or makes. Of course, Lewis famously describes how that happened for him, when he was a young atheist. And it wasn't even an explicitly Christian book, although it was written by a great Christian imagination, George MacDonald.
Right.
When he's reading that book, Fantastes, on the train.
Yes.
And he says it's almost as though the light from the book wasn't simply, it was beginning to transfigure everything. The railway carriage, the woods outside. And he has that beautiful phrase. He says he felt like he'd crossed a border. And then he says something like, I suppose, in a way, my imagination was baptized. And I would feel the same. Yeah. I came eventually to a fuller and glad, affirmation of Christianity in its fullness, and in what's disclosed in the scripture and in the creeds. But what started was really through poetry. My imagination was baptized before I was, and the rest of me just took a little longer to catch up.
Well, you needed a little water, it was in many ways provided by a chance encounter, wasn't it? In that you bumped into an interesting person.
Oh yeah, that was quite.
I love this story.
Yeah.
So
no, that was. Well, I was thinking. So I was sort of. I had been an atheist, and then reading Keats made me into an agnostic. Not
on the way.
So I was a kind of agnostic when I came up to Cambridge to study medieval literature. But I became really interested in medieval literature. So somebody said you should read St. Augustine as a background.
Right.
And I read the Confessions, and I was thinking, whoa, no longer could I believe that Christianity was this little thing that we'd grown out of, because, Augustine's mind is a bit bigger than mine.
Yes.
Now, then I began to study classical philosophy, and I read Plato, and I was compelled, by the Christian story, but I was also interested in the classical world. And one of the things I couldn't get, I could see how Plato was saying we're all in the shadowlands and we need to get out of the world of time and into the world of eternity. But the more I looked at the Christian claim, it seemed to be saying that the one who is already in that bliss comes down to be with us and affirms the body. And I just felt like, how do you hold that together? And I saw Augustine, and I was thinking about this so hard I physically stopped in the street. Like I was a bit of a waif and stray. And
we can't imagine.
In those days, my hair was really long. And so I was just thinking so hard I physically stopped, and somebody bumped into me behind, right from and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was thinking." And instead of saying, I realized it was a young academic, one of the fellows, well, clearly not a student. So I said, "I'm sorry, I was thinking." And instead of saying, "Well, get out of my way," or, go and think someplace else or whatever, this person looked straight in the eye and said, "What were you thinking about?"
Wow.
And I said, "Well, actually, I was thinking about Plato and Christ. I was just thinking about," and I said what I've just said to you. And he said, "Have you ever," he said, "Well, have you looked at this in Augustine?" I said, "Well, I'm wrestling with Augustine." He said, "Have you read the Greek fathers? I think Chrysostom or maybe Origen."
Yes.
And I thought, whoa, who's this? So I said, well, I don't really know those people. How do I read them? And he said, "Well, maybe you'd like to talk about this," and gave me a little card, and it said, Rowan Williams.
Rowan Williams.
And it was
Rowan Williams.
He was teaching,
who had become the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah, but he was a young teacher in Cambridge, and I had a conversation with him, which was extremely helpful.
Yes.
And then that was that. Then eventually, a little while after that, the penny dropped.
Yes.
And I did become a Christian, and I felt I need to do something about this. So I went to my college chaplain for confirmation classes, and we did those for a while. And then he said, "There's somebody I know I think you should really talk to," and the other confirmation candidates as well. And in fact, he's going to preach at the confirmation. He's a guy called Rowan Williams, and you should go and see him. So we all went back to him again.
Oh, my goodness.
And he preached at, we're talking back in February 1980, I was confirmed. He preached at my confirmation. Wow. And somewhere in the course of that, I realized that he was a poet. I mean, he's a really seriously good poet.
Right, he's a Welsh poet.
He's a Welsh bard, is what he really is.
He really is, yes.
And so we occasionally corresponded about poetry as well, and we've remained friends. But he was, and I'm not the only person who could tell you, way off record and off camera, that Rowan Williams has quietly stepped into somebody's life and just given them the key seeds and words.
Yes.
The Welsh poet Gwyneth Lewis is another person whom I know. So he's got a bit of a a gift for being in the right place at the right time with the right word, I have to say.
Well, Malcolm, you have the right words for many of us as we listen to your poetry, and we're happy that you've given us this right time to do it.
You.
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for being on Good God.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
You bet.